The slap echoed through first class like a gunshot. Deborah Crane, a 23-year veteran flight attendant, brought her open palm down across the hand of a 17-year-old black boy sitting in seat 2A, and she didn't even flinch. "I said don't touch me," she hissed, her voice dripping with authority she had no right to wield. The boy looked up at her, stunned, his boarding pass still clutched between his fingers. Every passenger in first class saw it happen. Not one of them said a word. Not one. And that silence, that deafening, cowardly silence, was about to cost every single person on Flight 1247 more than they could possibly imagine. If this story moves you, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to this channel right now. Follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Jalen Monroe woke up at 5:15 in the morning in a hotel suite that most people would never see the inside of in their entire lives. He didn't think about that. He never thought about that. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbed his eyes, and reached for his phone. There was a text from his father. "Safe travels, son. Call me when you land." That was it. No emojis, no long paragraph. Elijah Monroe was not a man who wasted words, and his son had inherited that trait like a birthright. Jalen pulled on a pair of dark jeans, a plain black hoodie, and a baseball cap that had no logo on it. He laced up his sneakers, grabbed his backpack, and looked at himself in the mirror for exactly 2 seconds. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was 17 years old, flying home from a college visit, and all he wanted was to get back to Atlanta before dinner. He took the elevator down alone. The lobby of the hotel was quiet at that hour, just a few business travelers rolling their suitcases toward the exit. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody ever did. That was the thing about Jalen. He moved through the world like someone who had been taught from a very young age that real power doesn't announce itself. His father had drilled that into him since he was old enough to understand. You walk into a room, Jalen, and you let the room figure you out. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your existence. The car service dropped him at JFK Terminal 4 at 6:45. He had his boarding pass on his phone, his backpack over one shoulder, and nothing else. No luggage, no entourage. No sign whatsoever that his father's net worth was measured in billions. He walked through security like every other passenger. He waited in line. He took off his shoes. He put his backpack on the belt and walked through the scanner without a word. When he got to the gate, he found a seat in the corner and put his earbuds in. A woman next to him was arguing with someone on the phone about a delayed connection. A man across the aisle was eating a breakfast sandwich and reading the Wall Street Journal. Nobody paid Jalen any attention, and that was exactly how he liked it. Boarding began at 7:30. Jalen stood up, walked to the priority lane, and handed his phone to the gate agent. She scanned it, smiled, and said, "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Monroe." He nodded and walked down the jetway. First class on this aircraft had 16 seats arranged in pairs on either side of a wide aisle. Jalen found 2A, the window seat, on the left side, and slid in. He put his backpack under the seat in front of him, pulled his hood down slightly, and leaned back. He didn't look around. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. And that was when Deborah Crane first saw him. She was standing at the front of the cabin, holding a tray of pre-departure champagne glasses, and her eyes locked onto him like a radar finding its target. She didn't move right away. She just watched. She watched him settle into the seat. She watched him pull out his phone. She watched him adjust his cap. And something shifted behind her eyes. Something cold. Something practiced. Deborah had been flying for 23 years. She had worked her way up from regional puddle jumpers to international first class, and she carried that seniority like a weapon. She knew every type of passenger. She knew the business travelers who barely looked up from their laptops. She knew the couples celebrating anniversaries who wanted to be fussed over. She knew the celebrities who wanted to be left alone. And she knew, or she thought she knew, when someone didn't belong. She set the tray down on the galley counter and walked over to her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Patrice, who was hanging coats in the closet near the cockpit door. "Who's in 2A?" Deborah asked. Patrice glanced down the aisle. "I don't know. Why? He looks young." "So, he looks very young, Patrice, and he's in first class." Patrice turned back to the coats. "People buy first-class tickets, Deborah. That's kind of how it works." Deborah didn't laugh. "I'm going to check on him." "He just sat down," Give him a minute." But Deborah was already moving. She picked up a champagne glass and walked down the aisle with the kind of smile that looked warm from a distance but felt like an inspection up close. She stopped at row 2 and looked down at Jalin. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome aboard. Can I offer you some champagne?" Jalin looked up. "No thank you, I'm good." She didn't move. "Are you sure it's complimentary for first-class passengers?" "I'm 17, he said. "So no, but thank you." Her smile tightened, just barely, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. 17, she repeated. "Are you traveling with a parent?" "No, ma'am, I'm traveling alone." "Alone? In first class?" Jalin met her eyes. There was no hostility in his expression, no attitude. Just a calm, steady gaze that belonged to someone who had been raised to look people in the eye when they spoke to him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Deborah tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're already forming an opinion and just looking for confirmation. "Well," she said, "if you need anything, just let me know." She turned and walked back to the galley, but she didn't let it go. She wouldn't let it go for the next hour, and that decision would unravel everything. The other passengers filed in. A man in a gray suit took 1A. A woman with a designer handbag and a small dog carrier took 3B. An older couple, probably in their 70s, settled into row 4. Each of them received a warm greeting from Deborah. Each of them was offered champagne with genuine charm. Each of them was made to feel like they belonged. Jalin noticed. He noticed everything. He had been noticing things like this his entire life. The slight change in tone, the way a smile could include or exclude, the way certain people were welcomed and certain people were tolerated. He didn't say anything. He just put his earbuds back in and closed his eyes. The cabin door closed at 8:15. The safety demonstration began, and Deborah stood at the front of the cabin delivering it with the mechanical precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. But even while she pointed to the emergency exits and demonstrated the seatbelt, her eyes kept drifting to 2A. The plane pushed back from the gate. It taxied slowly toward the runway. Jalin felt the familiar rumble beneath him and allowed himself to relax. He thought about his father's text. He thought about the college visit, about the campus, about the questions the admissions officer had asked him. He thought about home. And then the plane lifted off, and everything changed. They were maybe 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign still on, when Deborah appeared at his row again. This time she wasn't carrying champagne. This time her face was different. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was something harder, something that had been building since the moment she first laid eyes on him. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to see your boarding pass." Jalin opened his eyes and removed one earbud. "Sorry, your boarding pass. I need to verify your seat assignment." He looked at her for a long moment. "You scanned it at the gate." "I'm aware of that. I'm asking to see it now." The man in 1A glanced over. The woman in 3B lowered her magazine slightly. Jalin could feel the shift in the air, that specific kind of tension that comes when someone in authority decides to flex their power and everyone else holds their breath to see what happens. "Okay," Jalin said. He pulled out his phone and opened the boarding pass. He held it up for her to see. "Right there. Seat 2A, Jalin Monroe." Deborah barely glanced at it. "Who purchased this ticket?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Jalin's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered. He knew exactly what she was asking. He knew exactly why she was asking. And he knew that no matter what he said, she had already made up her mind. "My father purchased the ticket," he said quietly. "Your father. And what does your father do?" "Ma'am, with all respect, that's not really relevant to my seat assignment." Deborah leaned closer. Her voice dropped, but it didn't get softer. It got sharper. "I have a responsibility to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger in this cabin. If there's been an error with your booking, I need to know about it." "There's no error." "Then you won't mind if I check with the gate?" "We're in the air, ma'am." "I'm well aware of where we are." Jalin took a breath. A slow, measured breath, the kind his father had taught him to take when the world was trying to provoke a reaction it could use against him. "If you want to verify my booking, you can contact the airline. I'm happy to wait. But I'm not moving from this seat." Something crossed Deborah's face. Surprise, maybe. Or frustration. She wasn't accustomed to being met with calm resistance. She was accustomed to compliance. She was accustomed to people backing down, apologizing, making themselves smaller. This boy wasn't doing any of those things, and it infuriated her in a way she would never admit. "Fine," she said. "Stay here." She turned and walked back to the galley. Patrice was there organizing meal trays. She looked up when Deborah came in. "What was that about?" Patrice asked. "Something's off with the kid in 2A. "Off how?" "He's 17 years old, Patrice. Alone. In a first-class seat that costs $4,000. And he won't tell me who paid for it." Patrice set down the tray she was holding. "He said his father bought it." "That's what he said? So what's the problem?" Deborah's jaw tightened. "The problem is that it doesn't add up." Patrice stared at her for a long moment. There was something in her eyes, a question she was weighing whether or not to ask. Finally, she said it. "Deborah, would you be asking the same questions if he was a white kid in a blazer?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. "Don't do that," Deborah said. "I'm serious." "I said don't do that. This isn't about race. This is about protocol. There is no protocol for interrogating a passenger about who bought their ticket. I'm not interrogating him. I was standing right there. You asked him what his father does for a living. That's not protocol. That's personal." Deborah's face flushed. She grabbed a bottle of water from the cart and unscrewed the cap with more force than necessary. "I'm doing my job, Patrice. If you have a problem with that, you can document it." "Maybe I will." Deborah walked away without another word. But she wasn't done. She was nowhere close to done. And the next time she approached Jalyn Monroe, she would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 35 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers began to shift in their seats, opening laptops, adjusting pillows, settling in for the journey. The older couple in row 4 ordered tea. The man in 1A asked for a blanket. Everything was normal. Everything was routine, except for the storm that was building inside Deborah Crane. She had spent the last 15 minutes at the galley counter staring at her manifest screen looking for something, anything that would justify what she was about to do. She found nothing. The booking was clean. The ticket was paid in full. The passenger's name matched his ID. There was no irregularity, no flag, no note, nothing. But she went anyway. She walked back to row 2 with a purpose that everyone in the cabin could feel. Her footsteps were heavier now. Her posture was rigid. The warmth she had manufactured earlier was completely gone, and what was left was raw authority wielded without justification. "Mr. Monroe," she said. And even the way she said his name carried an edge, a mocking formality, as if she was humoring the idea that he deserved to be addressed that way. Jalyn removed his earbuds. "Yes, I've reviewed the manifest, and I'm going to need you to move to coach." The words hung in the air like smoke. The woman in 3B put her magazine down completely. The older couple in row 4 turned their heads. The man in 1A lowered his laptop screen. Jalyn didn't move. "Why?" "There's been a seating discrepancy, and I need to resolve it." "What discrepancy?" "That's between me and the airline." "Ma'am, I have a confirmed first-class ticket. I've shown it to you. There is no discrepancy." Deborah's voice hardened. "I'm not going to argue with you about this. I need you to gather your things and move to the back of the aircraft." "No." The word was simple, quiet, absolute. Jalyn said it without raising his voice, without clenching his fists, without any of the theatrics that Deborah was probably expecting. He just said no, and he meant it. "Excuse me," Deborah said. "I said no. I'm not moving. I have a valid ticket for this seat, and I'm staying in it. If there's a real issue, you can have the captain come speak to me." Deborah's face went red. Not pink. Red. The kind of red that comes from being publicly defied by someone you've already decided is beneath you. She reached forward, and what happened next would be replayed on every news station in the country within 48 hours. She grabbed the phone out of his hand. Jalyn's reflexes kicked in. He reached up to take it back, and Deborah brought her open hand down on his, a sharp, stinging slap that cracked through the quiet cabin like a branch snapping in winter. "Don't you touch me," she said. The cabin went completely silent. Every passenger, every set of eyes was locked on row 2. The older woman in row 4 brought her hand to her mouth. The man in 1A sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. The woman in 3B clutched her dog carrier closer to her chest as if she could shield herself from what she had just witnessed. Jalin looked at his hand. It was tingling, not from pain, but from the shock of it. The shock of being struck by a stranger. The shock of being struck by someone in uniform. The shock of being struck and having an entire cabin full of adults watch it happen and do absolutely nothing. He looked up at Deborah. His eyes were steady. His voice was low. "You just assaulted me. I defended myself. I was reaching for my own phone. You were being aggressive. I was sitting in my seat." Deborah leaned in and her voice dropped to a near whisper. But it was the kind of whisper designed to be heard by everyone pretending not to listen. "You need to move to the back. Now. Or I will have you restrained when we land." Jalin held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. He picked up his backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked down the aisle toward Coach without saying another word. Every passenger he passed avoided his eyes. Every single one. Some looked at their screens. Some looked at the ceiling. Some suddenly found something fascinating about the seat pocket in front of them. But not one of them looked at him, and not one of them said a word. He found an empty seat near the back, sat down and pulled out a second phone from the inside pocket of his backpack. A phone that Deborah didn't know about. A phone that connected to a number that very few people in the world had access to. He typed 4 words. "Dad, I need you." The response came in 11 seconds. "Tell me everything." Jalin typed for 2 minutes straight. He told his father what happened, every word, every look, every moment. He told him about the slap. He told him about the accusation. He told him about the silence of the passengers who watched a 17-year-old boy get hit by a grown woman and did nothing. Elijah Monroe read every word. And then he made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the airline's customer service line, not to the media. He called the CEO of the airline directly. Because Elijah Monroe didn't own a majority stake in the airline. He owned the holding company that owned the majority stake in the airline. And when Elijah Monroe called, people didn't just answer. They listened. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Elijah's voice was calm throughout. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He stated the facts, and then he made a single request that carried the weight of everything he had built over 30 years of his life. "Ground the flight," he said, "right now." And just like that, somewhere over Virginia, the captain of Flight 1247 received a message from operations that made him read it twice, then 3 times. Then he turned to his first officer and said, "We need to divert, immediately." "What's the emergency?" the first officer asked. The captain stared at the screen. "I'm not entirely sure, but we're going back." The nose of the aircraft dipped slightly as the plane began its descent. Passengers felt the shift, that subtle change in pressure and angle that tells you something is different. Conversations paused. Heads turned toward the windows. The seatbelt sign came back on with a familiar ding, and Deborah Crane, standing in the galley, felt the first cold thread of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. She picked up the interphone and called the cockpit. "Captain, what's going on?" "We're diverting back to JFK." "Why is there a mechanical issue?" There was a pause on the other end, a pause that lasted just long enough to be terrifying. "No," the captain said. "It's not mechanical." "Then what is it?" Another pause. "Deborah, I need you to come to the flight deck, now." She hung up the phone. Her hand was trembling just slightly, just enough for her to notice. She straightened her uniform, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the cockpit door. Patrice watched her go. And Patrice, for the first time that morning, allowed herself to feel what she had been suppressing since this whole thing started. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper. Something that settled in her chest like a weight. She looked down the aisle toward the back of the plane where Jalin Monroe sat with his backpack on his lap and his phone in his hand, staring out the window at the clouds below. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even upset. At least not visibly. He was waiting. Quietly. Patiently. The way his father had taught him to wait when the world was about to catch up with its own cruelty. And the plane kept descending. The passengers began to murmur. "What's happening? Why are we turning around? Is everything okay?" The man in one. A flagged down Patrice. "Excuse me, is there a problem with the aircraft?" "The captain will make an announcement shortly," Patrice said, though she didn't know if that was true. The older woman in row 4 grabbed her husband's hand. "Harold, something's wrong." "It's fine, Margaret. Probably just a precaution." But it wasn't fine. And it wasn't a precaution. It was something none of them had ever experienced before, and none of them would ever forget. Inside the cockpit, Deborah stood behind the captain's seat, and the captain turned to face her with an expression that made her stomach drop. "Deborah," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened with the passenger in seat 2A. Her mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I just received a directive from corporate operations to return this aircraft to JFK. Not a request. A directive. And the only explanation I was given is that there has been a serious incident involving a first-class passenger and a member of my cabin crew." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you again. What happened?" Deborah's lips parted, but no sound came out. The confidence that had carried her through the morning, the certainty that she was right, that she was justified, that she was protecting her cabin, evaporated like morning frost under a merciless sun. She stood in that cockpit, surrounded by instruments and switches and screens that monitored everything happening to the aircraft, and she realized that for the first time in 23 years, there was no protocol to save her. "I asked him to verify his ticket," she said finally. "He became difficult." The captain's eyes didn't waver. "Did you strike a passenger, Deborah?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound on that aircraft. And 6 miles below, in a corner office in a building that bore his name, Elijah Monroe set his phone down on his desk, folded his hands and waited for the plane carrying his son to come back to the ground. The captain was still waiting for an answer. Deborah could feel the hum of the aircraft vibrating through the floor beneath her feet, and she could feel something else vibrating too. Something inside her chest that she refused to call fear. She swallowed hard and looked at the first officer, hoping to find an ally. He wouldn't even turn around. "Deborah," the captain said again, "did you put your hands on a passenger?" He was reaching toward me. I reacted. It was instinct. Instinct. Yes. The captain pulled off his headset and placed it on the console. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger, the way a man does when he's trying to keep himself from saying something he can't take back. "Let me tell you what I know," he said. "I know that corporate operations just called me directly. Not dispatch, not scheduling. Corporate. The kind of call I have never received in 19 years of flying. They told me to return to JFK immediately, and when I asked why, I was told that a crew member physically assaulted a minor in first class. Those were the exact words. Physically assaulted a minor." Deborah's face went white. "That's not what happened." "Then what happened?" "I tapped his hand. That's all. He was being defiant. He refused to move seats, and when I tried to take his phone to verify his information, he grabbed at me." "You tried to take his phone to verify his booking?" "Deborah, you can verify a booking from the manifest screen in the galley. You don't need a passenger's phone for that. You know that." She opened her mouth and closed it again. The first officer still hadn't turned around, but his silence was louder than anything Deborah had ever heard. "Go back to the cabin," the captain said. "Don't speak to the passenger. Don't speak to anyone about this. Sit in the jump seat and wait." "Captain, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I said sit down, Deborah." She left the cockpit. The door closed behind her with a mechanical click, and she stood in the narrow corridor between the cockpit and the first-class galley. And for the first time in 23 years of service, she didn't know what to do with her hands. Patrice was in the galley pretending to organize meal trays. But she'd heard everything through the interphone that Deborah had forgotten to hang up properly. Every word, every excuse, every lie. She looked at Deborah and said nothing. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. Deborah sat down on the jump seat near the forward door. She buckled in. The plane was descending steadily now, and through the small window beside her, she could see the coastline coming back into view. They were maybe 30 minutes from landing. 30 minutes. That was all the time she had left as the person she thought she was. Back in Coach Jolin felt the plane banking left. He knew what that meant. His father had told him in that last text 3 words that changed everything. "It's being handled." Jolin didn't ask how. He didn't need to. When Elijah Monroe said something was being handled, it was already done. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the passenger next to him, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt, who had been stealing glances at him since he sat down. The man finally spoke. "You okay, kid?" Jolin looked at him. "I'm fine." I saw them move you up there. That didn't seem right. It wasn't right. The man nodded slowly. You want me to say something when we land, I mean. I could tell them what I saw. Jellin studied him for a moment. This man, this stranger, was offering more than 16 first-class passengers had offered combined. What's your name? Jellin asked. Greg Patterson. Thank you, Greg, but I think it's going to be okay. Greg looked like he wanted to say more, but something in Jellin's voice told him that this kid, this 17-year-old in a hoodie and a baseball cap, knew something that the rest of the plane didn't. So he just nodded and went back to looking out the window. The captain came on the intercom at 8:52. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to return to JFK due to an operational issue. I apologize for the inconvenience. We should be on the ground in approximately 25 minutes. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. Operational issue. That was the phrase he chose. It was technically true. It was also the biggest understatement anyone on that aircraft would hear for the rest of their lives. The murmuring started immediately. The man in 1A pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. The woman in 3B flagged down Patrice. What's the operational issue? Is it mechanical? Should we be worried? There's nothing to be worried about, Patrice said, though she wasn't sure that was true for everyone on board. The older woman in row 4. Margaret was squeezing her husband Harold's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Harold, they turned the plane around. They don't do that for nothing. It could be anything, Margaret. Weather, air traffic. It's not weather. The sky is clear. Harold didn't have an answer for that, so he just squeezed her hand back and said, We'll be fine. But 5 rows behind them in first class, something was happening that nobody expected. The man in seat 1A, the one in the gray suit who had been typing on his phone, suddenly stopped. He looked up. He looked around the cabin, and then he looked at the empty seat in 2A. The seat where the kid had been sitting before Deborah moved him. He turned to the passenger across the aisle, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose. Did you see what happened earlier with the boy? The woman lowered her glasses. I saw. She hit him. I know. And we just sat here. The woman didn't respond. She put her glasses back on and returned to her book, but her hands were shaking and she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. The man in 1A wasn't done. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and walked to the galley. Patrice looked up surprised. Can I help you, sir? The kid who was sitting in 2A, where is he? He's been reseated. Reseated? You mean he was forced out of his seat by your colleague? Patrice hesitated. Sir, I understand your concern. My concern is that I watched a flight attendant hit a teenager and then kick him out of first class for no reason, and now we're turning around and I'm starting to think those two things are connected. Patrice took a breath. I can't discuss crew matters with passengers, sir, but I hear you, and I want you to know that I hear you. The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned in. When we land, I'm going to talk to every person in authority I can find. Just so you know. I understand, sir. He went back to his seat. But something had shifted in the first-class cabin. The silence that had protected Deborah was beginning to crack. People were looking at each other. People were looking at the empty seat. People were starting to think about what they had seen and what they had allowed to happen. At 9:03, Jallin's phone buzzed. A text from his father. Lawyers on the ground. Media notified. Stay calm. Stay seated. I'm proud of you. Jallin read it twice. That last sentence. I'm proud of you. His father didn't say that often. Not because he wasn't proud, but because Elijah Monroe believed that pride was something you showed through action, not words. For him to write it, to actually type those 4 words and send them, meant that he understood exactly what his son had been through, and exactly how his son had handled it. Jellin locked the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Greg, who was now openly watching the first-class cabin from his coach seat, trying to read the body language of the flight crew. Something big is happening up there, Greg said. Yeah, Jallin said. Something is. At 9:14, the plane broke through the clouds over Long Island. The ground appeared below patchwork fields and highways, and the sprawl of suburban neighborhoods that led to the airport. Passengers on both sides of the aircraft pressed their faces to windows, searching for the runway, searching for some explanation for why their Tuesday morning had gone sideways. Deborah was still on the jump seat. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She had spent the last 20 minutes replaying the morning in her head, and with each replay, the story she told herself changed slightly. First, she was justified. Then she was overreacting, but not wrong. Then she was maybe a little wrong, but the kid had been difficult. Then she remembered the look on his face when she slapped his hand, and something cracked inside the story she was building, and she couldn't patch it. She thought about calling her union rep. She thought about her husband Dave, who was probably at the house right now drinking coffee and watching the morning news, completely unaware that his wife's career was disintegrating at 30,000 feet. She thought about her daughter, who was in college, who had posted something last month about racial justice on her Instagram, and she wondered what her daughter would say if she could see her mother right now. That thought was the one that broke through. Not guilt exactly. Something adjacent to guilt. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as guilt, but hadn't fully moved in yet. The landing gear dropped at 9:21. The cabin crew performed their final checks. Patrice walked through both cabins, her eyes meeting Jalen's briefly as she passed his row. She gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible. But he caught it. The plane touched down at 9:27. It was not a smooth landing. The captain brought it in firm and fast, the kind of landing that tells passengers the pilot has somewhere else to be. The thrust reversers roared, the brakes engaged, and Flight 1247 slowed to a crawl on runway 4, left at JFK. But they didn't taxi to the gate. The plane stopped on the taxiway and sat there. The engines idled, the seatbelt sign stayed on. And the captain came back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hold here on the taxiway for a few minutes while we coordinate our gate assignment. Please remain seated." That was a lie. Jalen knew it was a lie. The captain knew it was a lie. Deborah, sitting on her jump seat with her hands clasped in her lap, knew it was a lie. They weren't waiting for a gate. They were waiting for what was coming, and it came fast. Through the windows on the left side of the aircraft, passengers could see vehicles approaching on the tarmac. Not one vehicle, multiple vehicles. Airline operations trucks, a black SUV, a second black SUV, and a car with flashing lights. "Harold," Margaret said from row 4. "Those are not baggage carts." The first-class cabin erupted into anxious whispers. The man in 1A stood up despite the seatbelt sign. Patrice didn't stop him. She was watching the tarmac too. At 9:31, the cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that usually communicated competence and calm. Right now, it communicated something else entirely. He walked past Deborah without looking at her. He walked through first class. He walked through business class. He walked all the way to the back of the aircraft to where Jalen Monroe was sitting with his backpack on his lap. Every head on that plane turned to follow him. The captain stopped at Jalen's row. He looked at the boy. And then he did something that made Greg Patterson's jaw physically drop. He extended his hand. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Captain David Chen. I want to apologize to you personally for what happened on this aircraft today." Jalen looked at the hand. He looked at the captain's face, and then he shook it. "Thank you, Captain. I've been briefed on the situation. What happened to you was unacceptable, and I want you to know that it does not represent who we are as an airline, or who I am as a captain." "I appreciate you saying that." Captain Chen lowered his voice, but in the silent cabin every word carried. "There are people on the ground who need to speak with you. Representatives from the airline, and I believe your family's legal team is here as well. I'd like to deplane you first, if that's okay." Jalen nodded. "That's okay." The captain straightened up and addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to ask for your patience. We will begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for your understanding." He walked back to the front. As he passed Deborah's jump seat, he stopped. He didn't look at her. He spoke to the wall. "When the passengers are off, you will remain on board. Do you understand?" "Yes, Captain. Airline security will escort you." Deborah's throat closed. "Escort me where?" "Off this aircraft and into a formal review. That's all I've been told." He kept walking. The cockpit door opened and closed, and Deborah was alone on her jump seat again. But now the loneliness felt different. Now it felt permanent. At 9:38, the forward door opened. Fresh air flooded the cabin, carrying with it the sound of the tarmac jet engines in the distance, the hum of ground equipment. A man in a dark suit boarded the aircraft. He was followed by a woman carrying a tablet. They spoke briefly with Patrice, and then they walked to the back of the plane. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Thomas Grant, Vice President of Customer Relations. I'm here to personally escort you off this aircraft." Jalen stood up. He shouldered his backpack. He looked at Greg. "Thanks for talking to me, Greg." Greg's eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "You take care of yourself, young man." Jalen walked up the aisle. He passed business class. He passed first class. He passed the empty seat 2A, and he didn't look at it. He passed the older couple in row 4, and Margaret reached out and touched his arm as he went by. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry we didn't say anything." Jalen paused. He looked at her. "It's okay, ma'am." "It's not okay," she said, and her voice cracked. "It's not okay, and I know it." Harold put his arm around his wife and looked at Jalen with eyes that held something heavy and old and unresolved. He nodded once. Jalen nodded back. He passed the galley. He passed the jump seat where Deborah was sitting. And for one fraction of a second their eyes met. She looked at him the way a person looks when they are watching the consequences of their actions arrive in real time and cannot look away. He didn't say anything to her. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Jalen stepped through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge. Thomas Grant walked beside him, speaking into his phone. The woman with the tablet was already taking notes. And at the end of the jet bridge, standing just inside the terminal, were two men in expensive suits holding briefcases. A woman with a press badge around her neck and Elijah Monroe. Jalen saw his father and stopped walking. Elijah was standing with his hands at his sides, wearing a navy blue suit with no tie, looking exactly like what he was, a man who had built an empire from nothing and would burn any piece of it to protect his son. They didn't hug. That wasn't their way. Elijah put his hand on Jalen's shoulder and held it there firm and steady, and he looked into his son's eyes. "You okay?" "I'm okay." "Tell me you're okay and mean it." Jalen took a breath. "I'm okay, Dad. I handled it." Elijah's grip tightened on his shoulder. "Yeah, you did." He turned to Thomas Grant. "I want the flight attendant's name, her service record, the complete passenger manifest, and the cockpit voice recorder data. I want them by noon." Thomas Grant nodded rapidly. "Absolutely, Mr. Monroe. We're fully cooperating." "You're not cooperating. Cooperating implies you have a choice. You don't." The woman with the press badge stepped forward. "Mr. Monroe, Vanessa Rios, Associated Press. Can you confirm that your son was physically struck by a flight attendant on this morning's flight?" Elijah didn't look at her. "My attorneys will have a statement within the hour. That's all I'm going to say right now." He turned back to Jalen. "Let's go." They walked together through the terminal. The two lawyers flanked them. Thomas Grant trailed behind, still talking into his phone, his voice getting higher with every sentence. And behind them, back on the aircraft, 168 passengers sat in their seats, some confused, some angry, some ashamed. All of them beginning to understand that what had happened on Flight 1247 was about to become something much bigger than a diverted flight. And Deborah Crane sat on her jump seat alone, staring at the floor, listening to the sound of passengers filing past her without a word, each footstep a small, quiet judgment that she could not appeal. At 9:53, when the last passenger had deplaned, two airline security officers boarded the aircraft. They walked directly to her. One of them, a woman with short hair and an ID badge clipped to her belt, spoke first. "Ms. Crane, please come with us." Deborah looked up. "Where are we going?" "To a meeting with the Executive Review Board. Your union representative has been notified and will meet you there." "Am I being fired?" The security officer paused. "I'm not authorized to discuss that. Please gather your personal belongings." Deborah stood. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She reached into the overhead bin above the jump seat and pulled out her small crew bag. She straightened her uniform one last time, a reflex muscle memory from 23 years of making sure she looked the part. And then she walked off the aircraft, escorted by two people whose job it was to make sure she couldn't run from what she'd done. The jet bridge was empty now. Her footsteps echoed. And somewhere ahead of her, beyond the terminal doors, the world was already writing the first draft of a story that would define the rest of her life. Deborah's union representative was already in the room when she arrived. His name was Martin Kessler, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had spent the last 30 years negotiating on behalf of people who had made very bad decisions. He stood up when she walked in, and the first thing he said was not hello. "Don't say anything until I tell you to." Deborah sat down across from him at a long conference table in a windowless room deep inside the JFK Operations Center. The two security officers stayed outside the door. She could hear their radios crackling through the wall. "Martin, I need to explain what happened." "I know what happened. I've already been briefed. And right now explaining is the last thing you should be doing." "You've been briefed by who?" "By the airline's legal department. They called me 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes, Deborah. Do you know the last time legal called me directly about a crew incident? Never. That's the last time." Deborah pressed her palms flat against the table. "It's being blown out of proportion." Martin sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pity and frustration. "Do you know who that kid is?" "He's a teenager who was in a seat he had no business being in. He had a confirmed first-class ticket, Deborah." "I didn't know that at the time." "You had access to the manifest. You told the captain you were verifying his booking. You had every tool available to check, and instead of checking, you confronted him, demanded to know who paid for his ticket, asked what his father does for a living, and then physically removed his phone from his hand and struck him when he reached for it. That's not blown out of proportion. That's what happened." Deborah's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She held them there suspended the way a person does when they are fighting to maintain control of a situation that left their control hours ago. "I tapped his hand, Martin. I didn't strike him." "There are witnesses who say otherwise." "They're wrong. 16 of them." She didn't answer. Martin leaned forward. "Deborah, the boy's name is Jalen Monroe. His father is Elijah Monroe." Deborah shook her head slightly. "I don't know who that is." "Elijah Monroe owns Pinnacle Holdings. Pinnacle Holdings owns a controlling stake in this airline, the airline you work for, the airline that just grounded a flight because Elijah Monroe picked up the phone and said one sentence." The color drained from Deborah's face so completely that Martin thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible, it already happened. You slapped the hand of the son of the man who effectively owns your employer. And then you moved him to coach. And then you lied to the captain about it." "I didn't lie." "You told him you tapped the kid's hand. Patrice told the captain you hit him hard enough that she heard it from the galley." "Those are two different stories, Deborah. One of them is a lie." Deborah's composure finally broke. The tears fell. She pressed her hands to her face and breathed in sharp, ragged gasps that sounded like they were being pulled from somewhere deep inside her chest. Martin handed her a napkin from the table. It was a thin paper napkin, the kind they stock in airport conference rooms, and it was completely inadequate for the moment, but it was all he had. "Here's where we are," Martin said after she had wiped her eyes. "The airline's executive review board is assembling right now. They're going to want your account of what happened. They're going to have statements from Patrice, from the captain, and from at least 3 passengers who have already volunteered to provide their version. The Monroe family's legal team has filed an initial complaint alleging assault on a minor and racial discrimination. The Associated Press has the story. CNN has the story. It is 10:15 in the morning, and this is already the biggest news in the country." Deborah looked at him through wet, swollen eyes. "What do I do?" "You tell the truth. The whole truth. Not the version you've been telling yourself for the last hour. The real version. And then we see what's left." At 10:22, 12 miles from the airport, Elijah Monroe sat across from his son in the back of a black Escalade that was heading toward Manhattan. The 2 lawyers were in a separate vehicle behind them. Elijah had dismissed everyone else. He wanted to be alone with his son. He needed to see without an audience whether his boy was truly okay or just performing okay the way Elijah had taught him to. "Talk to me," Elijah said. Jalen was looking out the window. "About what?" "About what happened, not the facts. I know the facts. Tell me how you feel." Jalen turned from the window. He looked at his father, and for the first time since the incident, the mask slipped. Not all the way. Just enough. His jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. He pressed his lips together and held them there for a moment before speaking. "She looked at me like I was stealing something, Dad. Like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. And the worst part wasn't her. The worst part was everybody else. They all just watched. They watched her talk to me like that, and they watched her hit me, and they just sat there." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know. One lady. One lady at the end when I was getting off. She said sorry. 1. I know. You always told me that when something like this happens, stay calm. Don't give them the reaction they want. Use your mind, not your emotions. And I did that, Dad. I did exactly what you taught me. But you know what? It still hurt. Being calm doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Elijah reached over and put his hand on the back of his son's neck, a gesture he hadn't made since Jalen was 12 years old. Being calm means you controlled the situation instead of letting it control you. But you're right. It still hurts. It always hurts. And anyone who tells you it doesn't is lying to you. So what happens now? Now we make sure it costs them. I don't want money, Dad. Money. Elijah shook his head. This isn't about money. It's about consequences. That woman made a choice today. She chose to look at you and see a threat instead of a passenger. She chose to humiliate you. She chose to put her hands on you. And she made that choice because she believed there would be no consequence. We're going to prove her wrong. And the passengers? The ones who just sat there. Elijah was quiet for a moment. They'll have to live with that. And some of them will. For a long time. At 10:45, the story hit the internet. Vanessa Rios from the Associated Press filed a 3-paragraph breaking news alert that read like a match being struck in a room full of gasoline. Within 15 minutes, every major network had picked it up. Within 30 minutes, the airline's stock had dropped 2%. Within an hour, the hashtag Flight 1247 was trending on every platform in the country. The airline released a statement at 11:08. We are aware of an incident that occurred on a domestic flight this morning. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. The crew member involved has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this review. It was the kind of statement that said everything and nothing at the same time, and the public saw right through it. By 11:30, cell phone videos had surfaced. Not of the slap itself, but of the aftermath. One passenger in business class had recorded Jalen walking to the back of the plane, his head up, his face composed, carrying his backpack through an aisle of silent adults. Another passenger had recorded the moment the captain walked to the back to apologize. A third had recorded the convoy of vehicles approaching the aircraft on the tarmac. Each video was grainy, shaky shot in secret. Each one went viral within minutes. At 11:42, Patrice Okafor posted a statement on her personal social media. I was on Flight 1247 today. I witnessed what happened. I tried to intervene before it escalated. I was overruled. I will be cooperating fully with the investigation. What happened to that young man should never happen to anyone. Her post was shared 60,000 times in 2 hours. At noon, Deborah Crane walked into the Executive Review Board meeting. The room held 7 people: the airline's chief operating officer, the vice president of human resources, the head of legal Thomas Grant from customer relations, 2 union representatives, and a court reporter. Deborah sat at one end of the table. Martin Kessler sat beside her. The COO, a woman named Helen Park, spoke first. Ms. Crane, this is a formal review hearing. You are entitled to union representation, which you have. You are entitled to provide your account of the events. Everything said in this room is being recorded and may be used in subsequent proceedings, including litigation. Do you understand? Yes. Please describe what happened this morning, beginning with when the passenger in seat 2A boarded the aircraft. Deborah took a breath. Martin touched her arm once, a signal to proceed carefully. She began. He boarded with the first group. He was young, very young. He was wearing casual clothing, a hoodie and a cap. I noticed him because he seemed out of place in first class. Out of place how? Helen asked. He was alone. He was young. He didn't fit the typical profile of our first-class passengers. What is the typical profile of your first-class passengers, Ms. Crane? Deborah hesitated. She could feel the trap forming around her, could feel the ground softening beneath her feet. Business travelers mostly, older, well-dressed. So when you say he didn't fit the profile, you mean he was young and casually dressed? Yes. Is there anything else about him that contributed to your assessment? The room went still. Every person at that table knew what Helen Park was asking. Deborah knew what she was asking, and the court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting. No, Deborah said. It was his age and his clothing. Helen let the answer sit for a moment, then she moved on. Tell me about the first interaction. Deborah described offering the champagne, learning he was 17, asking if he was traveling alone. She described it calmly, methodically, as if she were recounting a routine service interaction. And then what happened? I went back to the galley. I discussed my concerns with my colleague Patrice Okafor. What were your concerns? That a minor was traveling alone in first class without a parent or guardian. Ms. Crane, we have hundreds of unaccompanied minors on our flights every week, many of them in premium cabins. Is it standard practice to question their ticket purchases? I was using my judgment. Was your judgment informed by anything other than his age? No, not by his race. Martin touched Deborah's arm again. My client has answered the question, Ms. Park. Helen nodded and continued. Tell me about the second interaction, the one where you asked to see his boarding pass. Deborah went through it. The boarding pass. The question about who purchased the ticket. Jalen's refusal to answer. She told it from her perspective, and even she could hear how thin it sounded. And the third interaction? Deborah's voice dropped. I told him there was a seating discrepancy and asked him to move to coach. Was there a seating discrepancy? I believe there might be. Did you check the manifest before asking him to move? I checked it after the first interaction. And what did the manifest show? That his booking was confirmed. So there was no discrepancy. I thought there might have been an error in the system. Ms. Crane, you just said the manifest showed a confirmed booking. Where was the error? Deborah didn't answer. She couldn't. Because there was no error, and they both knew it. Tell me about the phone, Helen said. Deborah closed her eyes. I reached for his phone to look at his boarding pass. You reached for a passenger's personal property. I was trying to verify his booking. You already verified it through the manifest. Why did you need his phone? I wanted to see the original booking confirmation. That is not something a flight attendant has any reason or authority to request. You know that, Ms. Crane. I was concerned. You were concerned. And in your concern, what happened next? He reached for the phone at the same time I did. Our hands collided. Collided? Yes. Ms. Crane, I have a statement from Patrice Okafor that says, and I quote, she slapped his hand away hard. I heard it from the galley. End quote. I also have preliminary statements from 3 passengers who describe the contact as a deliberate slap. Would you like to revise your characterization? Martin leaned over and whispered something in Deborah's ear. Deborah sat there for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Then she spoke. I may have used more force than I intended. Did you strike the passenger? I made contact with his hand in a way that was more forceful than I intended. Ms. Crane, did you strike the passenger, yes or no? The court reporter waited. The room waited. Martin waited. Helen Park waited. Yes, Deborah said, and the word came out broken, cracked down the middle like something that had been held together by nothing but stubbornness and had finally given way. Yes, I struck him. Helen Park wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked up. After striking the passenger, you told him, and I quote from a passenger statement, "Don't you touch me." Is that accurate? Yes. And then you instructed him to move to coach. Yes. And he complied. Yes. A 17-year-old boy who had just been struck by an airline employee whose valid first-class ticket had been confirmed on the manifest walked to the back of the aircraft because you told him to. Yes. Helen set her pen down. Ms. Crane, in your 23 years of service, have you ever asked a white passenger who purchased their ticket? Martin stood up. That question is inflammatory, and my client is not required to answer it. She's not required to, but the answer will inform our determination. Deborah looked at Martin. He shook his head. She looked back at Helen, and she didn't say no. She didn't say anything, but her silence was an answer that everyone in that room understood, and the court reporter typed the notation that the witness did not respond. At 12:47, while Deborah was still in the review hearing, something happened that nobody anticipated. A video surfaced online, not a cell phone video from a passenger, but security camera footage from the jet bridge at JFK. It showed Jalen walking off the aircraft, flanked by Thomas Grant and the woman with the tablet. It showed him walking steadily, shoulders back, head up. And then it showed the moment he saw his father at the end of the jet bridge. The moment he stopped. The moment Elijah put his hand on his son's shoulder. The video was 41 seconds long. There was no audio, But you didn't need audio. The body language said everything. A father. A son. A hand on a shoulder. The restraint of two people who had been taught that dignity is not a performance, it is a practice. That video was viewed 11 million times before sundown. And it changed the conversation from an airline incident to something much deeper. Something the country had been arguing about for decades and had never resolved. At 1:15, Elijah Monroe's legal team filed a formal complaint with the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Transportation, and the airline's board of directors. The complaint alleged assault on a minor racial profiling unlawful removal from a ticketed seat and failure of the airline to maintain adequate training and oversight of cabin crew. It requested the immediate termination of Deborah Crane, a public apology from the airline's CEO, the release of all internal communications related to the incident, and the establishment of an independent review committee to examine patterns of discriminatory treatment across the airline's operations. The complaint was 16 pages long. It was filed simultaneously with 3 federal agencies, and it landed on every newsroom desk in America within the hour. At 1:52, the airline's CEO, a man named Robert Ashford, who had been in a board meeting all morning, finally saw the full scope of what was unfolding. He read the complaint. He watched the jet bridge video. He read Patrice Okafor's statement. He read the preliminary passenger accounts. And then he called Elijah Monroe. Elijah answered on the second ring. "Robert?" "Elijah, I want you to know that I am personally appalled by what happened today. I've read every report, and I want to assure you that we will take swift and decisive action." "You already know what I want, Robert. We're moving toward termination proceedings for the flight attendant." "That's a start. That's not enough. What else do you need, you?" "I need you to understand something. My son is 17 years old. He is a good kid. He gets good grades. He visited a college yesterday that would be lucky to have him. He boarded your airline this morning with a valid ticket that I purchased, and he was treated like a suspect. He was interrogated, he was humiliated, he was struck, and he was removed from his seat while an entire cabin of adults watched and said nothing. This is not a customer service issue, Robert. This is who your company is." The line was quiet for a long time. "You're right," Robert said, "and I'm going to fix it." "I know you are, because if you don't, I will." Elijah hung up. He set the phone on his desk. He looked at the framed photograph that had sat on the corner of that desk for 14 years. A picture of Jalen at 3 years old, sitting on Elijah's lap, laughing at something neither of them could remember. Elijah put his finger on the glass and held it there, and for just a moment, the man who could stop airplanes with a phone call allowed himself to feel exactly what his son had felt at 30,000 feet. Powerless. And then not. Robert Ashford hung up the phone and sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the airline's corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. And he did something he hadn't done in 7 years as CEO. He canceled every meeting on his calendar for the rest of the day. His assistant, a woman named Claire, who had worked for him since before he took the top job, knocked once and opened the door. "The board chair is online too. Tell him I'll call him back in an hour. He said it's urgent." "Claire, everything is urgent right now. I need 1 hour." She closed the door. Robert turned to his computer and pulled up the airline's internal incident system. The report on Flight 1247 was already 17 pages long and growing. Statements from Patrice. Statements from the captain. Preliminary passenger accounts. And at the bottom, a single paragraph from the legal department that read like a warning label on a bottle of poison. Recommend immediate escalation to board level. Litigation exposure estimated at significant. Reputational damage assessment pending, but expected to be severe. Robert read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called someone whose number wasn't in the corporate directory. A woman named Diana Cross, a crisis management consultant who had steered 3 Fortune 500 companies through public scandals and come out the other side with their reputations bruised but breathing. She answered on the first ring, which told him she already knew why he was calling. "I've seen it," Diana said. "How bad is it internally?" "The flight attendant admitted to striking the passenger during the review hearing. She's done. That's the easy part. The hard part is everything else. Robert, the jet bridge video has 14 million views. It's been 2 hours. This isn't a news cycle anymore. This is a movement. What do I do?" You get on camera. Today, not tomorrow, today. And you don't send a spokesperson. You do it yourself. And you say the words that CEOs never want to say. Which words? This was wrong. We failed. And I'm personally accountable. Robert closed his eyes. The legal team will lose their minds. The legal team isn't the one whose face is going to be on every screen in America by tonight. You are. And you have exactly one chance to get ahead of this, Robert. One chance. After that, the narrative writes itself, and you become the villain. At 2:15, while Robert Ashford was rehearsing a statement he hadn't written yet, Deborah Crane was escorted out of the review hearing and into an empty office on the second floor of the operations building. Martin Kessler walked beside her. Neither of them spoke until the door closed. "How bad is it?" Deborah asked. Martin sat down heavily. "They're going to terminate you. The question is whether they do it quietly or publicly. They can't fire me without a full union review. Deborah, the union isn't going to fight this. I spoke with the regional president 20 minutes ago. He told me, and these are his exact words, we can't protect someone who assaulted a minor on camera." It wasn't on camera. The aftermath was. The jet bridge footage, the passenger videos, Patrice's statement. There's enough documentation to bury any grievance we file. Deborah leaned against the wall. So that's it. 23 years, and that's it. It doesn't have to be the worst version of this. If you cooperate fully, issue a genuine apology, and agree to the separation terms, there's a chance this stays at termination and doesn't become criminal. Criminal? The Monroe family filed a complaint alleging assault on a minor. That's a criminal matter in the state of New York, Deborah. If they press charges, this goes to a grand jury. Deborah's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. Her uniform skirt bunched around her knees, her crew bag beside her like a loyal pet that didn't understand what was happening. She pressed her forehead to her knees and made a sound that wasn't crying and wasn't screaming. It was something in between, something primal, the sound of a person watching their entire life reorganize itself around a single, irreversible mistake. Martin looked at her from the chair. He had represented flight attendants through DUIs, through insubordination hearings, through one truly spectacular incident involving a stolen beverage cart. But he had never represented someone through something like this, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had been in the business for 30 years that there was no version of this story where Deborah Crane came out whole. "There's something else," he said. Deborah looked up. "Your daughter called the union office. She saw the story online." Deborah's face crumpled. Of everything that had happened that day, every humiliation, every confrontation, every consequence, this was the one that broke through every wall she had built. Her daughter. Her 20-year-old daughter, who had posted about racial justice last month, who had marched in protests, who had argued with Deborah at Thanksgiving about bias and privilege and systemic injustice while Deborah rolled her eyes and said it was all overblown. That daughter now knew what her mother had done. "What did she say?" Deborah whispered. "She asked if it was true. The office told her they couldn't discuss it. She said she was going to call you." Deborah pulled her phone out of her bag. 3 missed calls from her daughter Megan. 2 missed calls from her husband Dave. 1 missed call from her sister. 14 text messages. She didn't open any of them. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while she was still sitting on the floor of a borrowed office in an airport operations building trying to remember how she had gotten here. At 2:31 across the country in Atlanta, Jalen Monroe walked into his family's home for the first time in 3 days. The house was large, but not ostentatious, set back from the road on a wooded lot in Buckhead. Elijah had bought it 12 years ago, not because it was the most expensive house he could afford, but because it reminded him of the house his grandmother had always talked about wanting, but never got. Jalen dropped his backpack by the front door and stood in the entryway. The house was quiet. His mother Lorraine was at her office downtown. She ran a nonprofit focused on education equity, and Jalen knew she had probably already heard about what happened because Elijah called her from the car. His phone buzzed. A text from his best friend Marcus. "Bro, you're on CNN. What happened?" Jalen stared at the message. He typed back, "I'll call you later." Then he put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and sat on a stool and did something he hadn't allowed himself to do all day. He put his head down on his folded arms and he breathed. Just breathed. Long, slow breaths that shook on the way in and steadied on the way out. He thought about the woman's face. Deborah. He couldn't stop seeing it. Not the anger, not the authority. The conviction. The absolute certainty in her eyes when she looked at him and decided he didn't belong. That was the part that lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs and wouldn't move. Because she wasn't guessing. She wasn't uncertain. She looked at him, and she knew with her whole body that he was in the wrong place. And she was willing to put her hands on him to correct it. He thought about what his father had said in the car. Being calm doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And he thought about all the times his father had probably said that to himself over the years, all the boardrooms and country clubs and restaurants where Elijah Monroe, a black billionaire in America, had walked in and felt that same energy. That same quiet assessment. That same calculation in people's eyes. The front door opened at 2:55. Lorraine Monroe walked in, and the moment she saw her son sitting at the kitchen counter, she crossed the room in 4 strides and wrapped her arms around him so tightly that Jalin couldn't breathe and didn't want to. "I'm okay, Mom." "Don't tell me you're okay. Let me hold you." He let her. For 30 seconds he let his mother hold him the way she used to when he was small and the world had hurt him and she could fix it by being close. Then he gently pulled back. "I handled it," he said. "I know you did. Your father told me everything." She held his face in her hands and looked at him with eyes that were fierce and wet at the same time. "I am so angry, Jalin. I am so angry that you had to go through that." "I know, and I am so proud of how you conducted yourself." Dad said the same thing. "Your father and I agree on very few things, but on you we are always on the same page." Jalin almost smiled. Almost. Lorraine let go of his face and pulled up a stool beside him. "The phone at my office hasn't stopped ringing. 3 news stations want interviews. The NAACP called. 2 congresswomen called. Everyone wants to talk about Flight 1247. Do I have to talk to them? You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But Jalin, I want you to think about something. What happened to you today happens to black boys and men every day in this country. Most of them don't have a father who can ground an airplane. Most of them just have to take it. Your voice could mean something to them." Jalin was quiet for a long time. He turned his mother's words over in his mind, the way he turned everything over carefully, thoroughly, looking for the truth underneath the surface. "Not today," he said. "But maybe. Not today. That's enough for now." At 3:12, Robert Ashford stepped in front of a camera in the airline's media center. The statement he delivered was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. He read it from a teleprompter, but his eyes kept drifting to the camera lens, and the people watching could tell that this was a man who was in genuine distress. Not performance, not corporate theater. Something real had broken through the executive armor. He acknowledged the incident. He called it unacceptable. He announced the immediate termination of Deborah Crane effective that day. He announced a full review of the airline's training programs related to bias discrimination and passenger treatment. He announced the formation of an independent advisory panel that would include civil rights leaders, customer advocates, and members of the public. And then he said the thing that Diana Cross had told him to say, the thing the lawyers had begged him not to say, the thing that would either save him or sink him. What happened on Flight 1247 this morning was not an isolated incident by a single employee. It was a failure of our culture, and that culture starts with me. I am personally accountable, and I am personally committed to ensuring that no passenger on any of our flights ever experiences what Jalin Monroe experienced today." He paused. He looked directly into the camera. "Jalin, if you're watching, I want to say something to you directly. I'm sorry. What happened to you was wrong. You deserved better, and we failed you." The press conference was carried live on every major network. It was the lead story on every evening newscast. And the clip of Robert Ashford saying, "I'm sorry," directly to a 17-year-old boy he had never met, became the most shared video in the country by 6 o'clock that evening. But the story wasn't over. It was barely beginning. At 3:45, Deborah Crane received her official termination notice via email. She was sitting in the back seat of a taxi, heading home to Queens. Martin Kessler had offered to drive her, but she wanted to be alone. She opened the email on her phone and read it 3 times each time, hoping that the words would rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. The email informed her that her employment was terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, including physical contact with a passenger, unauthorized removal of a passenger from their assigned seat, and dishonesty during the investigative process. Her security clearance was revoked. Her employee travel benefits were canceled. She was instructed to return her uniforms within 7 business days, 23 years, 4 commendations, over 2 million miles flown. And it ended with an email she read in the back of a taxi while a talk radio host on the driver's speakers discussed what she had done without knowing she was in the car. The real question, the radio host was saying, isn't whether she should have been fired. Of course she should have been fired. The question is, what kind of system allows someone like this to operate for 23 years without anyone catching it? Was this really the first time she treated a passenger this way? Or was this just the first time the passenger's father could do something about it? Deborah reached forward and tapped the driver's shoulder. "Can you turn that off, please?" The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Sure thing." He clicked the radio off. "Bad day." She didn't answer. At 4:20, she walked into her house. Dave was in the living room. He stood up when she came through the door, and the look on his face told her that he had spent the last several hours watching the news and reading the internet and trying to reconcile the woman he had been married to for 26 years with the person the whole country was talking about. "Deb," he said. "Don't. We need to talk about this." "Not yet." "Megan called 6 times. She's hysterical." Deborah set her bag down and pressed her hands against the hallway wall, bracing herself the way a person does when they're trying not to collapse. "What did she say?" "She asked me if it was true. I told her I didn't know the details. She said she saw the video, the one from the jet bridge. She said she could see the boy's face, and she could see him trying not to cry, and she asked me how her mother could do that to a child." The sound that came out of Deborah was barely human. It started somewhere in her stomach and tore its way upward, a wail that she muffled with both hands pressed against her mouth. Dave took a step toward her and she held up one hand to stop him. "Don't touch me right now, please!" He stopped. He stood 3 feet from his wife and watched her break apart in their hallway, and he didn't know whether to be angry at the world for what was happening to her or angry at her for what she had done to cause it. So he just stood there, caught between loyalty and honesty, which is the most painful place a spouse can stand. At 4:51, Deborah's phone rang. It was Megan. Deborah stared at the screen for 4 rings before answering. "Mom?" "Megan, I can explain. Can you? Because I've been trying to come up with an explanation all day and I can't. I physically cannot think of a single reason that makes what you did okay. It wasn't how they're saying it was. Mom, there's video. There are witnesses. There's a statement from your own co-worker. How is it different from how they're saying it was? It happened fast. I was concerned about security and things escalated." Security. He was a kid in a seat with a ticket. What security concern could there possibly be? "Megan, please." No, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to let you make this smaller than it is." "Mom, do you remember Thanksgiving? Do you remember when I tried to talk to you about bias and profiling and you told me I was being dramatic? You said people see racism everywhere because they want to see it. Do you remember that?" Deborah closed her eyes. "I remember. So, what was this, Mom? If it wasn't bias, what was it? Why did you decide that kid didn't belong in first class? Why him? Why not the white guy in the suit next to him? Why not the old couple? Why not the woman with the dog? Why him?" Deborah couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because the answer was something she had spent 53 years refusing to look at, and it was staring her in the face now, with her daughter's voice attached to it. "I need to go," Megan said. "I love you, Mom, but I need time." The line went dead. Deborah lowered the phone to her side. Dave was still standing in the hallway. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. "She hates me," Deborah said. "She doesn't hate you." "You heard her." "I heard a 20-year-old girl who is trying to figure out how to love her mother and be disappointed in her at the same time. That's not hate. That's growing up." Deborah looked at her husband. In 26 years of marriage, through arguments about money and in-laws and parenting and everything else that marriages argue about, Dave had never said anything that cut through her defenses the way that sentence did. She walked to the couch, sat down, and stared at the blank television screen. "I need to see that video," she said. "No, you don't." "I need to see it, Dave." He hesitated. Then he picked up the remote, turned on the television, and found a news channel. It took less than 30 seconds for the jet bridge footage to appear. They showed it in slow motion, with a commentator narrating over it. There was Jalen walking off the plane. There was his straight back, his steady pace, his face that was holding together through sheer willpower. And there at the end of the jet bridge was his father. The hand on the shoulder, the look between them. Deborah watched it once. Then she watched them play it again, and again. And each time she watched it, she saw something she hadn't seen before. She saw the boy's hands. They were trembling. His face was composed. His posture was perfect. His stride was even. But his hands were shaking at his sides. He was 17 years old, and he was walking off an airplane where a grown woman had hit him, and he was doing everything in his power to hold himself together, and the only thing that gave him away was his hands. She didn't realize she was crying until Dave handed her a tissue. "I did that," she said. "I made a child's hands shake." Dave sat down beside her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You did." At 5:30, as the sun began to drop toward the horizon, Elijah Monroe received a call from an old friend. A man named James Whitfield, who had been Elijah's roommate at Howard University 35 years ago, and who now ran one of the largest civil rights organizations in the country. "Eli, I've been watching this all day." "I know you have." "How's Jalen?" "He's processing. He's strong, but he's 17. No amount of strong prepares you for someone putting their hands on you because of what you look like." "Listen, I want to talk to you about something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." "Go ahead." "This is bigger than one flight attendant and one airline. You know that. This is happening every day on every airline, in every airport, and in every space where black people are expected to prove they belong. Jalen's story has the country's attention. The question is, what we do with that attention." Elijah was quiet. "I want to propose something," James continued. "A foundation, named after Jalen if he agrees, focused on passenger rights, anti-discrimination training, and legal support for people who experience what your son experienced but don't have the resources to fight back. You fund it, I run it, and we turn this moment into something that lasts longer than a news cycle." Elijah leaned back in his chair. He thought about what Lorraine had said to Jalen earlier. "What happened to you today happens to black boys and men every day in this country. Most of them don't have a father who can ground an airplane." "Send me a proposal," Elijah said. "I'll have my team review it tonight." "Tonight?" "While the iron is hot, James. That's the only time it bends." At 6:15, Jalen was in his room. The door was closed. His phone was on his desk face down, buzzing every few seconds with notifications he refused to look at. He was lying on his bed staring at the ceiling, and he was thinking about Greg Patterson. The man in coach who had asked if he was okay. The man who had offered to speak up. A stranger. A complete stranger who had shown more courage in 30 seconds than 16 first-class passengers had shown in an hour. He picked up his phone. He scrolled past every notification until he found the message app. He typed a text to his father. "Dad, there was a guy on the plane, in coach. His name was Greg Patterson. He was the only one who talked to me. Can your team find him? I want to thank him." Elijah responded in 4 minutes. "Already done. He contacted the airline to file a witness statement. I'll have his information for you by morning." Jalen put the phone down. He turned on his side and pulled the blanket up, not because he was cold, but because something about being covered made the world feel smaller and more manageable. He closed his eyes. He thought about tomorrow. He thought about the cameras and the reporters and the conversations he would eventually have to have with people who wanted him to speak for every black teenager who had ever been looked at the wrong way in a space they had every right to occupy. He wasn't ready for that, not yet. But he knew with a certainty that lived in his bones that when he was ready, he wouldn't be silent. He would be his father's son. He would be calm. He would be deliberate. And he would make sure that every word he said carried the weight of everything he had felt on that airplane, and chose not to let destroy him. The house was quiet. Somewhere downstairs, his parents were talking in low voices. Somewhere in New York, Deborah Crane was watching a video of him walking off her plane. Somewhere in the country, millions of people were sharing his story with a fury and a tenderness that he hadn't asked for but couldn't stop. And somewhere in a house in Coach Greg Patterson was sitting at his kitchen table, writing a statement about a kid in a hoodie who had handled himself better than every adult on that aircraft combined. Jalen pulled the blanket tighter and let the exhaustion take him. His last conscious thought before sleep was not about anger. It was not about revenge. It was about his father's hand on his shoulder at the end of the jet bridge, steady and warm and certain, and the 3 words Elijah had texted him from 6 miles below. "I'm proud of you." And for now, that was enough. Jalin slept for 11 hours. When he opened his eyes the next morning, it was Wednesday, and the world outside his bedroom had shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. His phone had 214 notifications. He didn't count them. The number was just there on the screen, stacking up like a wall between who he had been on Monday and who the world wanted him to be on Wednesday. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He could hear his mother downstairs, her voice low and measured, talking to someone on the phone. He could smell coffee. He could feel the soreness in his hand, not physical soreness, but the phantom ache of a memory that had embedded itself in his body. Every time he opened and closed his fingers, he felt Deborah's palm landing, not the pain, the shock of being touched in violence by a stranger who had decided, in the space of a heartbeat, that he was less than. He got dressed. Same jeans, clean hoodie, same sneakers. He looked at himself in the mirror the same way he had looked at himself in the hotel mirror yesterday morning, which felt like a lifetime ago. 2 seconds. That was all he gave his reflection. Then he went downstairs. Lorraine was at the kitchen island. She looked up when he came in, and her expression did that thing it always did when she was worried, but didn't want to show it. She smiled with her mouth and searched with her eyes. "Morning, baby." "Morning." "How'd you sleep?" "Hard. Long." "Good. You needed it." She slid a plate of eggs and toast toward him. "Your father is in his study. He's been on the phone since 5. "What time is it?" "Almost 9. Jalin sat down and picked up a fork. He ate slowly the way a person eats when they're not hungry, but know they need fuel for whatever is coming. After a few bites, he looked at his mother. "Did the story get bigger?" Lorraine set her coffee down. "Yes." "How big?" "Every network, every newspaper, every platform. Congress is asking questions. The airline stock dropped 4% yesterday and another 2 this morning. There are protests at 3 airports." Jalin put the fork down. "Protests? People are angry, Jalin. Not just about what happened to you, about what it represents." He stared at his plate. "I'm one person, Mom. I'm one kid on one airplane." "You're one kid on one airplane who happened to be filmed. That's the difference. There are 1,000 Jalins out there who never get filmed, never get believed, never get justice. You got all 3 in the same day. That means something to people." He pushed the eggs around with his fork. "Marcus keeps texting me. He says kids at school are talking about it." "What are they saying?" "Some of them are proud of me. Some of them think I should have fought back. Some of them just want to know what first class looks like." Lorraine almost laughed. Almost. "What do you think?" "I think I want to talk to that flight attendant." Lorraine's expression changed. The searching look became something sharper. "Talk to her? Why?" "Because everybody's talking about her. The news, the internet, Dad's lawyers. Everyone is telling her story for her. Nobody's asking her to tell it herself. To me." "Jalin, she struck you." "I know. I was there." "And you want to sit across from her. I want to understand. I want to look at her and ask her why. Not why she hit me. I know why she hit me. I want to know when she decided I didn't belong. Was it when I sat down? Was it when she saw my face? Was it before I even opened my mouth? I want to hear her say it." Lorraine was quiet for a long time. She picked up her coffee and put it down again without drinking. "That takes more courage than anything your father did yesterday. Dad stopped an airplane. You're willing to face the person who hurt you and ask her to be honest. That's harder than stopping an airplane." At 9:45, Elijah came out of his study. He looked like a man who had slept in a suit because he had. He had been on the phone with lawyers, board members James Whitfield and 2 United States senators since before dawn. He poured himself a coffee and stood across the island from his son. "James Whitfield sent the proposal for the foundation last night," Elijah said. "It's good. It's comprehensive. It covers legal aid for passengers who face discrimination, mandatory bias training certification for airline employees, and a public accountability dashboard that tracks complaints across every major carrier." Jalin listened without expression. "He wants to name it after you, the Monroe Initiative." "I don't need my name on it. It's not about your name. It's about recognition. People need a face to rally around. Right now that face is yours." "Dad, I want to talk to her. Elijah set his coffee down. Lorraine looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them, the kind of silent spousal communication that happens when two people have been co-parenting long enough to have an entire conversation without speaking. Talk to who? Elijah asked, though he already knew. Deborah Crane. Elijah's jaw tightened. Absolutely not. Dad. She put her hands on you, Jalin. She humiliated you in front of an entire cabin. She lied about it to the captain. And now you want to sit across from her and have a conversation. Yes. Why? Because punishing her doesn't change what she thinks. It just makes her quieter about it. I don't want her to be quiet. I want her to say it out loud. I want her to look at me and tell me the truth about what she saw when she looked at me. Because until she does that, she's just a fired flight attendant who got caught. She's not someone who learned anything. The kitchen was silent. Lorraine's eyes were wet. Elijah was gripping his coffee mug so hard his knuckles had paled. You're 17, Elijah said. I know how old I am. You sound like you're 40. You raised me. Elijah exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries the weight of a man realizing that his son has outgrown the protection he built around him. If we do this, it's on your terms, your timeline, your conditions, and our legal team is in the room. No lawyers. Jalin. No lawyers, no cameras, no statements, just me and her. I want a conversation, not a deposition. Elijah looked at Lorraine. She wiped her eyes and nodded once. Elijah turned back to his son. I'll make the call. At 11:20, Martin Kessler's phone rang. He was at his apartment in Queens, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of union documents that no longer mattered. He looked at the caller ID. It was a Manhattan number he didn't recognize. Martin Kessler. Mr. Kessler, this is David Reeves from the Monroe family's legal team. I'm calling on behalf of Jalin Monroe. Martin sat up straighter. I'm listening. Mr. Monroe has made an unusual request. He would like to meet with your client, Deborah Crane, in person. No lawyers present. No media. A private conversation. Martin was silent for 5 full seconds. You're serious? Completely. My client was just fired. She's facing potential criminal charges. And the boy she's accused of assaulting wants to sit down with her for a chat. Mr. Monroe doesn't view it as a chat. He views it as necessary. Necessary for what? That's between him and your client, Mr. Kessler. Martin rubbed his forehead. I'll talk to her. I'm not going to promise anything. He called Deborah 20 minutes later. She answered on the 5th ring, and her voice sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. What now, Martin? Something I didn't expect. The Monroe kid wants to meet with you. Silence. Deborah. Meet with me. Why? He wants to talk. About what? I don't know. His legal team says he wants a private conversation. No lawyers. No press. Is it a trap? I don't think so. But I'm not sure it matters. You're already at the bottom, Deborah. What's he going to do, fire you again? There was a long pause. Martin could hear her breathing shallow and uneven, the breathing of someone who hadn't slept and wasn't sure they deserved to. When? She asked. Tomorrow, if you agree. Where? They'll arrange it. Neutral location. Another pause. This one lasted so long that Martin almost asked if she was still there. Then she spoke, and her voice was different. Smaller. Stripped of every defense she had left. Okay. Okay. Tell them yes. The meeting was arranged for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock at a mediation center in Midtown Manhattan. Elijah didn't like it. Lorraine didn't like it. The lawyers didn't like it. But Jalin was immovable, and everyone who had watched him walk down the aisle of Flight 1247 with his head up and his hands shaking knew that when this boy decided something, the decision was final. At 1:55 on Thursday, Deborah Crane walked into the mediation center. She was wearing plain clothes, no uniform, no wings pinned to her lapel, no name tag. She looked 10 years older than she had looked 2 days ago. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours total since Tuesday. Her daughter still hadn't returned her calls. The internet had found her home address, and Dave had taped cardboard over the windows because people were driving by to take pictures. She sat in a small room with a table and 2 chairs. A glass of water was in front of each chair. Nothing else. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. At 2:03, the door opened, and Jalin Monroe walked in. He was wearing the same kind of outfit he always wore. Jeans, hoodie, sneakers, no jewelry, no statement. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table and she could see them. Steady, not shaking, not anymore. They looked at each other. For 10 full seconds, neither of them spoke. The room was so quiet that Deborah could hear the blood pulsing in her own ears. Jalin spoke first. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think I had a choice." "You did. You always had a choice. That's kind of the point." Deborah's lip trembled. She pressed them together and nodded. "I'm going to ask you something," Jalin said. "And I want you to tell me the truth. Not the version you told the review board. Not the version you told your union rep. The truth. Can you do that? I can try." "When I sat down in seat 2, what went through your mind?" "The very first thought." Deborah's eyes dropped to the table. She stared at the glass of water like it held the answer somewhere at the bottom. "My first thought was that you were in the wrong seat." "Why?" "Because you were young and dressed casually." "Is that all?" Her chin quivered. "No." "Say it." "Because you were black." The word hung in the air between them like a held breath. Jalin didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He just waited. "I looked at you." Deborah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I saw a kid who didn't belong in first class. I didn't check the manifest first. I didn't ask myself why I thought that. I just felt it, in my gut. I felt it, and I trusted it, and I acted on it, and I was wrong. I was completely wrong. When you came back the second time and asked who paid for my ticket, what were you looking for?" "I was looking for proof that I was right. And when the manifest told you I had a confirmed booking, I ignored it, because the booking didn't match what I had already decided." "And the third time, when you told me to move to coach?" Deborah's eyes filled. "I knew. By then I knew there was no discrepancy. I knew the ticket was valid. I knew you had every right to be there. But I had already committed to my version of who you were, and admitting I was wrong felt impossible. So you hit me instead." The tears fell. Deborah didn't wipe them away. She let them run down her face and drop onto the table, and she didn't look away from Jalin, because looking away would have been the last act of cowardice, and she couldn't afford another one. "I hit you because you didn't back down. And I wasn't used to that. I was used to people being intimidated by the uniform, by the authority. I expected you to be scared and you weren't, and that made me angry. Not because you did anything wrong, because you took away my power and I didn't know what to do without it." Jalin leaned back slightly. He looked at this woman, this 53-year-old woman who was sitting across from him with mascara running down her cheeks and 23 years of career in ruins around her feet, and he felt something he didn't expect. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something before forgiveness. Something that had to come first. "Understanding. I want to tell you something," Jalin said. "And I want you to hear it not as an accusation, but as a fact. When you made me walk to the back of that airplane past every passenger who was watching, I felt like I was walking through every generation of my family's history. My great-grandfather picked cotton. My grandfather was told to use the back entrance. My father was pulled over 11 times before he turned 30 because he drove a nice car. And I was walked to the back of a plane because I sat in the front. That's not just a seating issue, Ms. Crane. That's a legacy." Deborah broke. Not the way she had broken in the operations office or in her hallway or on the phone with her daughter. She broke the way a person breaks when they finally see the full weight of what they've done. Not as an incident, not as a career-ending mistake, but as a link in a chain that stretches back centuries. She put her hand over her mouth and sobbed, and the sound was ugly and honest and real. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry." "I hear you. Do you believe me?" Jalin considered the question carefully. "I believe you're sorry. I believe you're in pain. I believe that 2 days ago, you didn't think you were capable of what you did, and now you have to live with the fact that you were. But believing you're sorry and trusting that you've changed are two different things. One takes a moment, the other takes a lifetime." Deborah nodded. "What can I do?" "You can tell the truth, publicly, not because anyone is making you, because you owe it to every person who has ever been looked at the way you looked at me and didn't have someone to call. You can say what you said to me in this room in front of the world, and you can let it cost you whatever it costs you. That's what accountability looks like. And if I do that, then maybe your daughter will call you back." Deborah's eyes widened. She hadn't mentioned Megan. She hadn't said a word about her daughter. But this boy, this 17-year-old boy, had seen through every wall she had left and found the wound that hurt the most. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because if I did what you did, my mother wouldn't call me back either. And that would be the part that broke me." They sat in silence for a full minute. Then Jalin stood up. He pushed his chair in. He looked at Deborah one last time. "I don't hate you, Ms. Crane. I need you to know that. I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'll carry what happened on that plane for the rest of my life. But I don't hate you, because hate would mean you won. And you didn't." He walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle, and then he turned back. "One more thing. That seat 2A, I'm going to sit in it again. Every time I fly, and I'm going to think about you. Not with anger, with memory, because memory is how we make sure it doesn't happen again." He left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Deborah sat alone at the table, her hands flat on the surface, her tears still falling, staring at the empty chair where a boy had just taught her something that 53 years of living hadn't managed to. 3 days later, Deborah Crane posted a video statement online. She sat at her kitchen table, no makeup, no script. She looked into the camera and said what she had said to Jalin, every word of it. She admitted to racial profiling. She admitted to lying. She admitted that her gut feeling was not instinct, but bias, and that she had spent 23 years trusting it without question. The video was 9 minutes long. She cried through most of it. It was viewed 28 million times. 1 week later, the Monroe Initiative was formally established. Elijah Monroe provided the founding capital. James Whitfield served as executive director. Jalin sat on the advisory board, the youngest member by 20 years. Within 6 months, the initiative had partnered with 14 airlines, trained over 30,000 employees, and provided legal support to 112 passengers who had experienced discrimination and had no one to call. 2 weeks after the video, Megan Crane called her mother. They talked for 3 hours. Neither of them recorded it. Neither of them shared it. Some things are not for the world. Greg Patterson received a handwritten letter from Jalin that arrived at his home in New Jersey on a Thursday afternoon. It said in part, "You were the only one who saw me. Not my ticket. Not my hoodie. Not my skin. Me. Thank you for that. It mattered more than you know." Greg put the letter in a frame and hung it in his hallway, and every morning when he left for work, he touched the frame once the way some people touch a prayer. Patrice Okafor was promoted to lead flight attendant on international routes. She accepted the position on the condition that she be allowed to help redesign the airline's onboard conduct training program. The airline agreed. The first module of the new program was called The Empty Seat, and it began with a simple question. When you look at a passenger, what do you see first, and is what you see the truth? Captain David Chen continued to fly for the airline for another 8 years before retiring. In every crew briefing before every flight, he added one line that was never in the manual. "Every passenger on this aircraft paid for the right to be here. Our job is to serve them, not to judge them." And Jalin Monroe flew home to Atlanta on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after Flight 1247 in Seat 2A on the same airline. The flight attendant who greeted him in first class offered him a glass of water and called him Mr. Monroe and treated him exactly the way every passenger deserved to be treated. Jalin thanked her, put in his earbuds, and looked out the window as the plane climbed above the clouds. He didn't think about Deborah. He didn't think about the cameras or the lawyers or the 28 million view video or the foundation that bore his name. He thought about his father's hand on his shoulder. He thought about Greg Patterson's quiet decency. He thought about Patrice's small nod in the aisle. And he thought about the simple, immovable truth that had carried him through the worst day of his young life and would carry him through every day that followed. Dignity is not loud. It does not perform. It does not beg to be recognized. It stands. It holds. It endures. And in the end, it is the only thing that no one, not a stranger in a uniform, not a cabin full of silence, not a world full of judgment, can ever take away.